On the 23rd of June, 1551, 600 severed heads swayed on iron spikes along London Bridge. Their hollow sockets stared toward the Thames, and across each brow, in drying blood, someone had written the same promise like a curse. You will be human again, in hell. Crows wheeled so thick in the pale morning sky they blotted out the sun, turning dawn into a dirty twilight. The air was heavy with a sweet, sickening rot, threaded with the smoke of the pyres where the headless bodies burned. Inside Whitehall, a 14-year-old king stood at a window and watched it all as if he were staring at rain. Edward VI looked almost transparent beneath his royal silks, pale as parchment held too close to a candle, his face drained of expression. No one understood that it hadn't begun with a royal decree at all. It began with a scream. At Billingsgate Market, a fishmonger swore she had seen a beggar from the East End crouched in the shadow of an archway, tearing into a rat with his bare teeth. She said his eyes glowed yellow in the dim light. By midday the rumor had swollen into something monstrous. The poor of London were turning into wolves at night, stalking children through narrow alleys, leaving behind only gnawed bones and slick pools of blood. A city that had been starving for 3 years, broken by failed harvests and hollowed by hunger, lashed onto the story with the panic of a drowning man grabbing at anything sharp enough to feel real. And that was the part that made it truly unbelievable. How did a dying boy, shaking with tuberculosis, barely able to stand, unleash the bloodiest witch hunt in England's memory? Why didn't his advisors, men seasoned by war, by court intrigue, by betrayal, stop the madness before it spread? How did 600 people die for a crime no human body could commit? And what was really hiding behind those yellow eyes that dozens of witnesses claimed they had seen, again and again, across the city? Edward had inherited the crown at 9 years old, already carrying death inside him like a second heart. His mother, Jane Seymour, died 12 days after giving birth, taken by fever, and the boy entered the world through the gate of her death, as if fate had marked him from his first breath. By 14, his lungs were ruined. Every cough brought blood. His skin had a waxy clarity that let courtiers see the blue lines of veins at his temples. The doctors whispered that the king would not live to see Christmas. But no one dared speak it aloud within earshot of the Duke of Northumberland, the true power in England, who kept the dying child on the throne like a puppet with a crown. The famine of 1549 had turned London into a kind of living hell. The price of bread rose eightfold. Mothers smothered their own infants just to silence the screaming hunger. In Southwark, bodies lay stacked in the streets because there was no strength left to bury them. The wealthy barricaded themselves inside their townhouses and hired armed guards, while crowds of beggars, walking skeletons in rags, scratched at their gates with shaking hands. Even the Thames seemed sick. Drought had drawn it down to a sluggish brown ribbon, and dead fish rotted along the exposed banks, adding another layer of stench to a city that already smelled like ruin. It was into this atmosphere, this pressure of desperation and fear, that the rumor of werewolves slipped like poison into water. At first it came as scattered reports. A night watchman swore he had seen a figure on all fours, chewing on something beside a cemetery wall. A priest insisted he had heard howling rising from the cellar of an abandoned house on Cheapside. A butcher in Smithfield found his apprentice dead, with his throat torn open, wounds he claimed could not have been made by any human teeth. By early June, all of London spoke of the same thing. Hunger was turning the poor into beasts, stripping away their human faces and leaving only predators behind. On the 12th of June, a priest from St. Olave's brought what he called proof to the King's Council. In a wooden box lay a skull that, he insisted, belonged to a werewolf killed by parishioners in Shoreditch. The bone was distorted, stretched long, with protruding teeth that truly looked animal in the torchlight. Modern medicine would have recognized it as a rare disease of the bone, but in that chamber, where Edward sat on his throne, gasping between coughing fits, the skull became unquestionable evidence. God had turned his face away from England. The Duke of Northumberland was not a man known for superstition. He was cold, practical, calculating. Yet in the city's panic, he saw a door opening. Hunger had pushed the people close to rebellion, and he needed a scapegoat, an enemy to absorb their rage and redirect it. Werewolves were perfect. They came from the lowest streets. They could be blamed for the lack of food. Of course, the beasts were devouring the stores, and their extermination would bring no protests from the nobility. He leaned close to the young king, whose mind was fogged with fever and the opium his physicians used to dull the pain, and he whispered words that turned a rumor into a massacre. The decree was issued on the 15th of June. All Londoners showing wolfish signs were to be arrested at once and brought to trial. But what counted as wolfish signs? The order was written to be deliberately vague: yellowing eyes, extreme thinness, a life lived by night, the eating of raw meat. By those rules, nearly every starving soul in London qualified, gaunt with hunger, jaundiced from failing organs, forced to steal and swallow whatever could be found. By sunset, the city guard had begun their sweeps through the slums of Southwark and the East End. They ripped people from their miserable hovels, dragged them through the streets, and hauled them toward Tower Hill as if the entire city were feeding its own into the jaws of a blade. The trials were a joke that rarely lasted more than 5 minutes per person. Judges appointed by Northumberland did not weigh evidence or listen to testimony. They held a torch up to the accused and stared straight into their eyes. If the whites looked yellow, and famine often ruined the liver, staining the eyes that color, the sentence was automatic: death by beheading. There were no lawyers, no witnesses for the defense, no appeals, only the axe, falling from dawn to dusk, turning the Tower Yard into a slaughterhouse where blood ran in streams toward the Thames. By the 19th of June, 200 people had been executed, their heads raised on spikes along the bridge as a warning. Yet panic only tightened its grip, because the killings and disappearances did not stop. Each morning brought fresh bodies, found in alleys with their throats torn open, and the crowd demanded more heads. Priests thundered from their pulpits that demons had crawled up from hell to punish England for abandoning the true faith, and only the blood of the unclean could soothe God's wrath. Edward grew weaker, more distant, less present in his own life. He signed warrants with a trembling hand without reading the names, pressing the royal seal onto whatever papers Northumberland placed before him. There was one detail the chronicles preferred to bury because it was too ugly to repeat. Many of the condemned were children. Hungry orphans from the streets, their eyes yellowed by starvation, their bodies stripped down to bone. Their heads were too small for the long adult pikes, so they were nailed to wooden boards and hung lower, at the height of a passerby's gaze. Witnesses said some of them were still crying as they were led to the scaffold, begging for mercy that did not exist. Even the executioners, men trained to do violence without flinching, began drinking before their work to drown whatever conscience remained. On the 21st of June, something happened that should have ended the madness. Instead, it drove it straight to its peak. The Lord Mayor's daughter, a 7-year-old girl with golden curls, vanished from her room in the middle of the night. By morning she was found in the garden, dead, with bite marks on her neck and arms. The Lord Mayor, shattered by grief, demanded immediate action. Northumberland saw an opportunity to prove the threat did not care about rank or bloodline. He ordered mass executions of every remaining suspect, with no further trials. Over the next 48 hours, another 400 people were beheaded on Tower Hill. The executioners worked in shifts, their axes blunted by endless use. Some victims needed 3, even 4 strikes before the head finally came free. The screams of the condemned mixed with the ringing of metal, forming a brutal chorus that carried across the city. Blood soaked so deep into the ground that grass refused to grow there for 10 years. By the evening of the 23rd of June, 600 heads stood along London Bridge and the city gates. The bodies were dumped into mass pits beyond the walls, dug so shallow that hands and feet stuck up through the soil. A sinister silence settled over London. Streets emptied, because no one dared step outside after dark. Shops shut their doors. Markets went still. The city became a haunted shell, inhabited only by crows and rats feasting on what was left behind. And then something happened that no one expected. The killings stopped. Night after night passed without new victims. No screams in the darkness. No fresh bodies with torn throats. Within a week, it became clear that whatever the threat had been, it was gone. Priests proclaimed it a divine victory, proof that the executions had pleased the Lord. Northumberland declared that royal resolve had defeated evil. But ordinary Londoners understood a darker truth. Hunger ended not because food arrived, but because the city had 600 fewer mouths to feed. Modern research offers another explanation, colder and more believable. The bite marks on the victims, once blamed on werewolves, were likely the work of rats, multiplying in filthy streets and thriving on the abundance of corpses. The starving, weakened by famine, could not defend themselves from swarms of desperate rodents that attacked in their sleep. The yellow eyes were the sign of liver failure brought on by malnutrition, and the howling heard in the night was probably not wolves at all, but the cries of people dying of hunger, voices their neighbors feared or refused to answer. As for the skull with fangs the priest had presented as proof, it most likely belonged to someone with a congenital jaw deformity, or it had been altered after death. In an era when science bowed to superstition and despair drowned reason, people saw monsters where there were only victims. Edward VI, manipulated by Northumberland and blinded by sickness, became the tool of a slaughter aimed at the most defenseless in society. Edward died on the 6th of July, 1553, barely 2 years after the werewolf killings. His body had been broken by tuberculosis, and perhaps poisoned by the same men who used him like a crowned puppet. His final words, recorded by a court physician, were simple: "Lord, save me from the wolves." No one knew whether he meant the creatures of rumor or the real predators who crowded his throne. Northumberland was executed for treason 3 months later. The crowd that came to watch was the largest London had ever seen, drawn to the death of the man who had turned their city into a butcher's yard. The heads on London Bridge remained there until 1556, when the new Queen, Mary, ordered them taken down and buried. But the words carved into the city's memory, "You will be human again, in hell," survived far longer. For the next century, parents frightened disobedient children with stories of the Boy King, who killed people for the color of their eyes, and of wolves who walked London streets wearing human faces. Modern historians often prefer silence about the massacre of 1551 because it does not fit neatly into the story of the English Reformation as a progressive awakening. It is easier to speak of Edward's religious reforms, of his education, of his contribution to Protestant theology. Yet the archives keep the truth alive: execution orders, lists of names, receipts paid to overworked executioners. 600 lives erased in a week, because famine, superstition, and political calculation formed the perfect storm of insanity. The bitterest irony is this: if there were wolves in London in 1551, they were not the starving poor with yellowed eyes. The true predators sat in halls of power, turning human desperation into a weapon, using fear as a tool of control. The wolves wore royal cloth and signed death warrants, while their victims, hungry, helpless, died with God's name on their lips and a hope for mercy that never came. London Bridge remembers their blood even now, and on especially foggy nights, people still claim you can hear it, the echo of 600 screams that were never meant to be forgotten.